Okay, welcome everybody. This is the call to order for the Horseshoe Crab Management Board. I'm John Clark. I'm the Administrative Commissioner from the fabulous First State, and I will be chairing this meeting. So we will now move on to our board consent items. Does anybody have any changes to the agenda? Do not see any. Okay, so we'll consider that approved by consent. And does everybody's had a chance to look at the proceedings from the May 2022 meeting. Does anybody have any revisions to the proceedings? Not seeing any. Those are approved by consent. Okay, we'll move on to the next item, public comment. And this is public comment for items that are not on the agenda. We know there's a lot of interest in the next agenda item, and when we discuss that, we will take public comment on that item, but right now this is public comment on items that are not on the agenda. Okay, don't see any hands. We don't have any sign-ups, so now we'll move on to the next item. That is to consider draft addendum 807, I'm sorry, on the implementation of recommended changes from the 2021 Adaptive Resource Management Revision and Peer Review Report for public comment. And as you know, we approved the ARM for management use at the January board meeting, and we approved starting the draft addendum at the May meeting. And so now Caitlin's going to bring us up to speed as to where we are now and where we'll be going next. Okay, thank you. Take it away, Caitlin.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So thanks, John did a quick summary of where we are, but for the presentation today, next slide, I'm just gonna cover some of that background leading up to this meeting, and then review the recommended changes to the ARM that are being considered in the addendum, the proposed action timeline, the proposed management options, and then finally wrap up with the board action for consideration and next steps. Next slide. So just as a refresher on the current management process, Addendum 7 to the Horseshoe Crab FMP established the Adaptive Resource Management, or ARM, framework for recommending bait harvest quotas for the Delaware Bay region. And under Addendum 7, the ARM annually recommends a bait harvest package, which is based on the abundance of both horseshoe crabs and red knots. And as you all know, this ARM went through a revision process and peer review process, which the board accepted in January 2022. And through that process, the ARM was updated to address some of the peer review critiques that were made about the original ARM framework. It includes new data sources to improve the models, and also adopts a new modeling software to replace the previously used program, which is now obsolete and can no longer be used to run the ARM model. So at that January meeting, the board also initiated draft addendum 8 to consider using the revised ARM to set the annual specifications for horseshoe crabs of Delaware Bay origin, which is what the board is discussing today. So this slide, next slide, shows the conceptual model of the ARM framework, which I just wanted to briefly show to remind everyone how it works. So you can see the ARM involves population models for both horseshoe crabs and Rufa red knots, which incorporates survey data for both species. In the ARM revision, the major changes that were made to the whole framework were improvements to the horseshoe crab population dynamics model and the red knot population dynamics model, revised reward function that relates those two, and the transition to the new software, as well as harvest recommendations on a continuous scale rather than discrete harvest packages. And the model can now be more easily updated with new data. So I want to note here that through that review process, the conceptual model of horseshoe crab abundance influencing red knot survival and reproduction has been maintained to ensure that the abundance of horseshoe crabs does not become a limiting factor for the population growth of red knots. Next slide. This is our current timeline for draft addendum 8. The board initiated the addendum in January, and since then the PDT, or plan development team, has met a number of times and developed the draft addendum document before you today. So today the board will consider draft addendum 8 for public comment. And if it is approved today, the public comment period could occur in September or late August through September, and the board could meet again in November 2022 to consider final action on the addendum. Next slide. So within the draft addendum, we have two main options. Option A would be a no action option, and option B would be to use the revised ARM for management to set bait harvest specifications for the Delaware Bay. So for option A, we use the no action option because true status quo is no longer an option due to the fact that the previous ARM model and the software that was used for it is now outdated and it cannot be updated. So this means it's no longer adaptive resource management. And option B would incorporate all of the changes that were recommended in the 2021 ARM revision and in the peer review in terms of the data and model updates. But the general structure of how the ARM optimal harvest recommendation is allocated among the 4 Delaware-based states would essentially be the same. So I'll go over exactly what the proposed changes are in a few slides. So under option A, if we take no action, the management would revert back to the provisions of Addendum 6. And this means the quotas for the 4 states of New Jersey through Virginia would go back to what is shown in this table. Next slide. In addition to those quotas, Addendum 6 prohibits directed harvest and landing of all horseshoe crabs in New Jersey and Delaware from January 1st through June 7th, and it prohibits female horseshoe crab harvest in New Jersey and Delaware for the remainder of the year from June 8th to December 31st. It also prohibits the landing of horseshoe crabs in Virginia from federal waters from January 1st through June 7th, and it mandates that no more than 40% of Virginia's annual quota may be harvested east of the Coal Rigs Line in ocean waters. And it also requires that horseshoe crabs harvested east of the Coal Rigs Line and landed in Virginia must be comprised of a minimum male to female ratio of 2 to 1. Next slide. So alternatively, option B would adopt the changes recommended in the 2021 ARM revision, and going forward, the revised ARM would be used for recommending and setting the bait harvest specifications for Delaware Bay origin horseshoe crabs. Option B addresses each of the aspects that were established in Addendum 7 related to how harvest specifications are set, and this includes the harvest recommendations that come out of the ARM, the adaptive management cycle, the percent harvest of Delaware Bay origin crabs for each state, and then the state allocations and fallback options. So I'm going to walk through each of these one by one and review what's proposed in Draft Addendum 8. Next slide. So first, on the issue of harvest recommendations, the addendum proposes that the revised ARM be used to annually recommend the optimal harvest levels for males and females. And I want to note that the maximum number of males and females that the ARM can recommend is the same as before at 500,000 males and 210,000 females. However, where the original ARM recommended 1 of 5 discrete harvest packages of males and females, the revised ARM recommends sex-specific harvest levels on a continuous scale. So that means the optimal harvest recommendation for males and females could be any number from 0 to the maximum amount of males and females. So for this issue, there are 2 sub-options that would take that optimal harvest output from the ARM for each sex and round it down to the nearest 25 or 50,000 crabs. And rounding the harvest recommendation to some degree is necessary because Delaware Bay specific biomedical data, which is confidential, would be fed into the model. And so rounding that output would prevent anyone from being able to back calculate the biomedical mortality input data. So sub-option B1 would generally result in a harvest recommendation that's closer to the optimal harvest, and sub-option B2 would generally result in a more conservative harvest recommendation. But one clarification here to add is that if the ARM does recommend the maximum amount for either males or females, rounding would not be necessary to protect the confidential data, because in that case, you're already doing that by limiting it to the maximum. Next slide. So this table shows what the harvest recommendations for 2017 through 2019 would have been if they'd been produced with the revised ARM. So as a note, in these examples, the CSMA or Catch Multiple Survey model uses the coast-wide biomedical mortality data rather than Delaware-based specific data. So this means these numbers are slightly overestimated from what would come out of the model if we use the Delaware-based specific biomedical data. So as you can see here, each of these years, the ARM recommends a maximum amount of male harvest and a varying amount of female harvest, around 150,000 crabs. Next slide. So using the 2019 optimal harvest recommendations from the last slide, which are shown again in the uppermost table here. The lower two tables below that show what each of the two sub-options for rounding would produce for the final harvest recommendation. So under B1, the optimal harvest of 144,803 crabs gets rounded down to 125,000 crabs. And under B2, the female harvest gets rounded down to 100,000 crabs. And as I noted before, the male harvest does not get rounded down because it's already being capped at 500,000. And so the biomedical mortality data could not be back calculated. Next slide. So next slide. Sorry, I didn't realize there were boxes there. So this is the second item under option B, and it's the management process for using the ARM framework. So it's slightly modified from the text in Addendum 7 to more clearly describe each of the steps of the short and long-term management process and ARM revision process. So under the option B, there's a 3-level process that would be adopted, including an annual management process, an interim update process, and a revision process. And the annual management process is basically the same as the annual cycle described in Addendum 7, which is what we use now, where the ARM framework is used to produce harvest recommendations for the upcoming fishing year. The interim update process is a new addition, and that's that every 3 years, the model parameters, including things like red knot survival and recruitment and horseshoe crab stock recruitment relationships, would be updated based on the most recent years of data that are routinely collected for the region. And then the third level is a more intensive revision process that would occur every 9 or 10 years or sooner if desired by the board, in which the ARM framework would undergo a revision process similar to what occurred for the 2021 ARM revision. And this 9 to 10 year timeline was selected because it allows for 2 interim updates to occur, and it also encompasses a generation for horseshoe crabs. Next slide. So our third issue is the proportion of harvest that is of Delaware Bay origin for each state, and this value is called lambda. So as the 2021 revision recommends, option B would update the lambda values for each state based on more recent genetic data, and this would result in decreases to the proportion of Maryland and Virginia's harvest that is assumed to be of Delaware Bay origin, and Delaware and New Jersey's proportions would remain unchanged. So as you'll see shortly, these lambda values do affect the state by state allocations of the overall Delaware Bay quota. Next slide. Here, this is a comparison of the current lambda values that are used in the original ARM and Addendum 7 with the proposed updated lambda values. Next slide. So the fourth issue is the methodology for calculating the state allocations of the total Delaware Bay harvest. Under option B in draft Addendum 8, the only change to the allocation methodology from Addendum 7 is that those updated lambda values would be used, which results in new allocation weights for each state. So with this change, the new state allocations of the Delaware Bay harvest limit would be shown, those shown in the top table. And with the change, the allocations for New Jersey and Delaware slightly increase, and the allocations for Maryland and Virginia slightly decrease. So the other two aspects of the state allocations, which are the harvest cap provision and the 2-to-1 male-female offset provision, would remain status quo from Addendum 7 under option B. And just to describe what those are, the harvest cap for Maryland and Virginia limits the total level of allowed harvest by those two states in order to provide some protection to crabs that are not of Delaware Bay origin. So the caps are shown in the bottom table, and those were based on Addendum 6 quota levels for Maryland and Virginia. And these caps do not apply when the ARM framework outputs an optimized harvest that prohibits female harvest of horseshoe crabs. So as a result, to date, these harvest caps have not come into play because since the original ARM was implemented, it has not recommended a female harvest. So the 2-to-1 offset is relevant when the ARM recommends 0 female crab harvest for the Delaware Bay. And so when that recommended female harvest is 0, this provision allows a 2-to-1 offset of males to females, which means the total male harvest allocation of Maryland and Virginia is increased at a 2-to-1 ratio, and it's allowed to rise above the cap level. So again, here we're only talking about Virginia's quota for crabs east of the Kohlrags line, just for clarity. Next slide. And so these are the state allocations under Addendum 7 compared with the proposed allocations under Addendum 8. Next slide. So this is as an example to show you if the total harvest quota for Delaware Bay that comes out of the ARM is 500,000 males and 100,000 females. The breakdown among the 4 states would look like this. So this is just the Delaware Bay portion of the state's quotas, not their total quotas when you add in non-Delaware Bay origin crabs. But I'm gonna go to the next slide and show you. On this slide, you can see both the Delaware Bay origin quotas, which are on the left in blue, and the total quotas on the right in orange. And these totals include the non-Delaware Bay origin crabs. And you can see for each of the states using the revised allocations. So Delaware and New Jersey are the same on both sides because 100% of their harvest is considered Delaware Bay origin crabs, while Maryland and Virginia's overall quotas, which are in red, are greater than their Delaware Bay only quotas to account for those additional crabs in their harvest that are not of Delaware Bay origin. So I also want to note in this example that the harvest caps for Maryland and Virginia are being applied because there is female harvest recommended in this example. And the other thing I want to note is that Maryland and Virginia's overall quotas end up being the same as what was in Addendum 4 and 6. And the quota for Virginia shown here is just the quota for east of the Kohlrags line. Next slide. So the last item in option B is the fallback option for if the ARM cannot provide a harvest recommendation in a given year. Option B includes the same fallback options as Addendum 7, which is that if in a given year there's not enough data, or the model cannot produce a harvest recommendation, the next year's harvest may be set either based on Addendum 6 quotas and management measures for New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia coastal waters, or it can be based on the previous year's ARM framework harvest level and allocation for the 4 states. Beyond that language, this section is just updated to reflect the new data sets that are required for running the revised ARM model, but this is essentially the same as Addendum 7. Next slide. So this is the tentative timeline for the next steps for draft Addendum 8. So today, again, the board will consider the document for public comment. And if it's approved today, public hearings could be held in September. And the board could consider the addendum for final approval at the annual meeting in November of this year. Next slide. So with that, the 2 things the board could choose to do today are to specify any desired changes to the document before releasing it for public comment and to consider approval of the addendum for public comment. So that's my last slide. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. And so if we have questions at this point, and I was remiss before, I wanted to point out that also up here we have Kristen Anstead, who led the ARM development process here, which was been phenomenal. And we also have Brett Hoffmeister, who's head of the advisory panel for horseshoe crabs. So does anybody have any questions for Caitlin about the addendum? Yes, Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm hoping Commission staff might be able to speak to the letter that was received from Earth Justice with the records request, because it seems like that's something we should discuss as part of this discussion of whether to send the addendum out for public comment at this point. As I understood that letter, it was referencing a records request to the Commission and to USGS and US Fish and Wildlife Service, and also asking that this body delay sending the addendum out for public comment until that records request is met and the information could be considered. So I'm just wondering if Commission and staff could speak to how the Commission responded or plans to respond to that request. Issues around data confidentiality that might be relative to that request, and also kind of considerations for what meeting this request or not meeting it or meeting it partially could mean for sort of the future of the science program that we're conducting here for this species, or even assessments for other species. So that's a whole host of stuff, but I'm just kind of hoping someone can speak to that. Thanks.
Thank you. And somebody else who's up here that can answer these questions is Tony Kern. So Tony, you want to take that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question, Justin. The Commission did receive an information request. It was the first request after we posted our new policy on information requests from Earth Justice. And we responded back to Earth Justice on all parts of the information they requested, either with the data or where to reach out to receive the data. And so what the commission did provide was information that we own, I guess you would call it, or information that the commission created and housed. So for the models that use the ARM, I would call it that we have 3 main models for that. And the CMSA model, which is what we use to assess the population, is the model that the commission owns. So we did provide that to the requesters, as well as, I'm gonna make sure, Kristen will inform me if I say this wrong, but the data that was used in the run itself. Some of the, if you use the raw data, some of that raw data could be confidential, or it's not proprietary to the commission because we did not collect that data. And so we pointed out to them on raw data sets that are used in that and who it was at the state or federal agency or university that they could make that request to them from. The other 2 models are not property of the commission, and they are for USGS, and so we sent them to USGS for that information. And USGS is responding to a very similar FOIA request for them, as well as US Fish and Wildlife Service. And so in terms of if all of the models were provided to the requesters, as I said before, there are confidential data sources in these models. So you would not, the requesters would not be able to receive that confidential information, so they would not be able to replicate the exact runs that the ARM subcommittee did use because of that. I will also just point out that in terms of transparency, that question was asked of us earlier at the executive committee. The commission did send out a press release notifying that the ARM peer review would be happening. That peer review was open to the public. It was posted on the calendar as well. And anybody that wanted to follow along on how the ARM worked, minority reports that were asked of the committee could have done so. There's public comment during those peer reviews. And we went back and looked, and we did not have very many public in attendance for those that are asking these questions of the commission at this time. I'm trying to make sure I'm hitting on all the points that you raised. Am I missing anything that you were hoping to receive, Justin?
Want to follow up, Justin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that pretty much covers it. I guess to summarize, it would be fair to say that at this point, the commission has released any information that is proprietary to the commission, non-confidential, that we can release, including some models, so that the models, even without the source data, somebody could look at the modeling code and see how the models work, and that we directed the requester for those sources of information we couldn't provide to where they could go request that information from outside the commission.
John, one more piece. I'll
Sure
just
thing,
note that, you know, some of the questions that are being raised on the different, I guess, data information that there's discrepancies on, some of that was brought up in these minority reports, and the peer review looked at those, addressed them, sensitivity analyses were done on those. And that's all in the peer review report, which is posted to the commission's webpage. And those questions could be asked of committee members as well if they're, you know, people wanted to have more information on this, but we haven't received any specific questions about those minority reports or the peer reviews review of them.
Thank you for that question, Justin, and thank you for the very thorough answer, Tony. It's good to get that on the record. Are there other questions about the addendum itself from the board? Is there anybody online? Okay. At this point, we have a question from the audience there. You like to come up to the public microphone?
Thank you very much, John Hare, NOAA Fisheries. Tony, thank you for describing the peer review process for the horseshoe crab model. Is that the sort of the standard process that ASMFC follows for all of its assessments and advice?
That is correct, John.
Thank you very much. May I comment, Mr. Chair?
Sure thing, John.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't recognize.
No.
My eyes aren't what they used to be.
My
I was
eyes aren't
somebody-
good either.
You're right. Go right ahead.
I mean, again, it's, there's been the thorough peer review process, which is how we have defined, evaluating science to use in our management decisions. And if that process needs to be revisited, then Science Center is happy to work with ASMFC on revisiting processes and helping where we can. But as far as I can, listening to Tony describe, it sounds like your peer review and scientific process has been followed. There are opportunities to bring new science into that process. So just encourage you to think about supporting the processes that you have in place.
Thank you, John. Is that all we have in terms of questions at this point? All right. I would say to the board, maybe the next step could be that we get a motion up here about this addendum, and then we can have a discussion amongst the board and also then take comments from the public at this point. So is anybody ready to offer a motion? I see Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully staff has this motion prepared. That's the quick and dirty version. Just for clarification purposes, let me say what that entails. It would be moved to approve draft addendum 8 on the implementation of recommended changes for the 2021 Adaptive Resource Management Revision and Peer Review Report for public comment, which has been whittled down to read, move to approve draft addendum 8 for public comment as modified today. I don't know as we modified it today.
Correct. Maya, could you please remove as modified today? Thank you.
Do we have a second? Mike Luisi. And now let's have discussion on that. Roy, would you like to start the discussion since you made the motion?
I'd like to put on record that by approving this draft addendum 8 for public comment, it is not approving specific harvest levels that are contained in addendum 8. That becomes a board decision at future meetings. In other words, by approving this addendum, it is not saying necessarily that the Delaware Bay jurisdictions will approve a female harvest scenario. That's yet to be determined. This is a framework for how we will manage this, or can manage this species in the future, but it'll be annual decision making involved. So I just wanted to state that. But I think if we're going to hang our hat on the ARM model, which we have for many years now, this is an upgrade that needs to happen. The original ARM model is no longer appropriate. It's outmoded. And this is the right thing to do because it's the best available science for us in managing horseshoe crabs. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. And Mike, did you have anything to add as the seconder?
What Roy said. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else have any comments they'd like to make about the motion? Okay, I see Bill, Justin, Joe, and go ahead, Bill.
Thank you. Just a quick question, and I think it's largely a follow-up to the question that Justin had asked. earlier and that Tony had responded to, and that's, obviously there are FOIA requests that are being filed elsewhere for information that the commission does not have control over. And I think some of the people that are reaching out to us and others would ask, is there a benefit in waiting until those FOIA requests are addressed elsewhere before taking this first step? I'm not advocating for that, but I feel that the question needs to be asked.
Would you like to respond to that, Bob? Thank you.
Well, I don't think I have much to add, Bill, beyond what Tony said earlier. I think, our peer review process was followed, and, it was an open and transparent process, and the public was able to participate throughout that process. And we at ASMC have responded as well as we can with all the information we do have that's non-confidential to the folks that ask for information from us. I think the difficult part is, at the end of the day, folks some of the requesters of this information want to recreate the model. They want to be able to rerun the model, tweak the model, and recreate the output that that went through peer review. And the difficult part there is going to be that recreating the exact runs that the technical committee, stock assessment committee, and peer reviewers looked at. You can't do that unless you have access to all the confidential data. So someone could rerun that model if they had the software package, which was pretty complicated to do that, but they can probably get kind of close by making assumptions about confidential data and lumping together confidential data and other things, but they won't be able to recreate the total runs because of the data confidentiality laws at the state and federal level. So I guess where I'm going is I'm not sure how much additional information the public will have at the end of the day once all those FOIA requests at the federal level are fulfilled. I don't think we'll be able to, the requesters will be able to completely rerun the model and do exactly what the technical folks have done just because of confidential data. I don't like giving that answer because I wish everyone could access all the data, we could see everything and it was an open book, but the confidentiality laws are what they are and we can't share those things. So those are the laws. So I don't know. I guess the question is, what additional information would be available and how much better would the public be able to comment? And they won't be able to recreate everything that has taken place up to now.
You want to follow up, Bill?
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and I appreciate that response. And I just want to mention that I also appreciate the point that Roy made earlier that this model is providing recommendations and that the board is not obligated to determine to set harvest levels at the numbers that are kicked out by the model if it ultimately does get approved and put into practice.
Thanks, Bill. Next, I have Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is, what would be the implications of delaying sending the draft addendum out for public comment at this point, perhaps indefinitely till all the records requests were satisfied? What would be the implications for management next year of the horseshoe crab fishery?
As you all know, we can no longer run the old ARM model. So we would not be able to do those, the interactions with current information. The only thing that we would be able to do is the Addendum 7 allows us to, in the event that you can't run the ARM, you can just use the previous year's package, or the board can default back to the Addendum 6 quotas. So, and that's pre-ARM. So it takes into no consideration how horseshoe crab and red knot interact.
All right, thanks. Next question is from Joe Semino.
Yeah, not really a question, just a discussion on the motion, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Since we did have the minority reports and the authors of those were given the opportunity to be at the peer review and give their responses, I think that added level of exchange is important. So I think, really the public has a great deal of information to go back through the peer review and the responses to the minority reports. And that is available prior to this document coming out and their chance to go through the public comments. I think one of the interesting things that came out of the peer review was not really a concern for the model, but just, you know, where the ARM model is trying to bring management or co-management for these species was talked about by the peer reviewers, with suggestions that, you know, maybe there's a next step to come. And one of the suggestions I believed was to consider management strategy evaluation. And I think through this public process, that might be part of the discussion that should happen as well. But I fully support the motion.
Thanks, Joe. Next, we have Mike Luisi, then we have a couple from online.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I said it before, I fully support the rationale that Roy gave in continuing to develop draft addendum 8 and moving this forward to the public. And I certainly understand the concern about, you know, this request for information, and I support third-party requests for information to try to understand more fully the work that's being done and presented to the board. My concern about delaying as a result of a third-party request for information is that it could set up a precedent down the road for whenever a third party wants a delay, they would ask for information that may or may not be available to try to slow down the process that we're undertaking. And I just don't like that idea that somebody could just start asking for more information just to slow us down if we decide that we would pause here and wait for something more to develop with that request. So I support moving forward today, and we'll look forward to hearing from the public if that's approved. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Online, we have Rick Jacobson of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Like to make comment?
Yeah, yes, thank you. And just for everyone else, my name is Rick Jacobson. I'm the Assistant Regional Director for Fisheries and Aquatic Conservation in the Northeast region, and I'll be representing the service on the Horseshoe Crab Management Board portion of this meeting. We at the service are committed to the duality of species recovery and sustainable use. In that context, we've been actively engaged in the acquisition, compilation, analysis, and interpretation of the best available science to guide our decision-making in fulfilling these dual roles. And we've concluded that the ARM revision is a manifestation of that best available science. The service is aware of concerns from some stakeholders about the possibility of take under the ESA if the ARM revision is adopted for management use. With that, we've conducted an analysis to evaluate the risk of take and have determined that the risk of take of red knot under ESA is negligible. Thus, we're supportive of moving the draft addendum forward for public comment. The service is also committed to transparency. And to meet that commitment, we will make our analysis available to the public before or coincident with the start of the ARM revision public comment period. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Next up, we have Chris Wright from NOAA Fisheries.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we support moving forward with the current process and going out to the public. And I just wanted to, maybe we should clarify that the peer review process was an independent process. You know, the peer reviewers were independent, and that I believe they also had access to that confidential data, so that they did have, I believe they did have that. And if we can clarify that for the public so that they know that those peer reviewers saw the whole thing, I think that might help. But we're in support, and I think it's critical that we move forward with this, since we don't have the old model anymore. And I think this helps more with the red knot situation and our ESA requirements on the federal side.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to answer your point about the peer review.
Yes, so for the 2019 benchmark, the full SAS and the peer review panel all had access to confidential data. And that's when the catch survey model was originally brought forward for a model for horseshoe crab and fully reviewed, getting into that data. For the ARM revision, we use the same model We used coast-wide data to develop this full ARM model so that we didn't have to deal with the confidential data at such a, at that scale. So the peer review panel actually didn't have access to the confidential data. They saw the run using coast-wide data. They saw the output of models with confidential data and determined, that the sensitivity runs around that, that it wasn't, it didn't really move the needle all that much. We're not talking about large numbers here. And so the peer review panel actually didn't see the confidential data. That's not the only confidential data that's in question here. There's also tagging bird data that's confidential. So it's not just biomedical that is a question mark here. So some of the inputs to the bird side of the models also is confidential.
Thank you, Kristen. And did that fill what you were looking for there, Chris?
Right. I just wanted to make sure that folks knew that throughout the whole process, there was access to that data, especially initially, and that, just as Kristen mentioned, that there was a lot of scrutiny under this from both the federal side and from the public, and there was a more than ample opportunity for folks to and the peer reviewers to access and have a full review of the process.
Thanks, Chris. Do we have any other comments from commissioners, either at the table or in the virtual realm? Anybody? Okay, we don't have any there. Before we call the question, is there any members of the, I'm sorry. Okay. Do we have anybody from the public then that wants to make comments? Just give us a second here. Okay, we have a comment from Tim Dillingham. Tim, please go right ahead.
And Tim, there you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I think I got myself off mute there. Tim Dillingham, I'm the executive director for the American Littoral Society based up in Highlands, New Jersey. We've been involved for a long time in the horseshoe crab and shorebird recovery work. And I want to thank the board for their thoughtful discussion and really identifying and raising some of the central questions. I guess we would like to raise 2 points in asking you to delay this and to give it further consideration. I don't think anybody opposes the idea of updating the model so that it's functional and it can be used, and making it as accurate as possible. But I think in that technical work of updating the model, the new addendum changes the fundamental policy that's been in place since 2009 when this conversation started. And that's this idea of reserving or not providing utility to the female horseshoe crab take until the crab populations and the red knot populations have recovered. And I think, as far as the idea of whether or not the peer review process was sufficient in flagging these important issues, in the peer review report itself, it acknowledges this is because the changes would lead to the harvest of female horseshoe crabs, which have been restricted since the implementation of the original ARM framework. The panel cautions the working group to fully consider if the new reward function truly represents the values articulated by stakeholders in the 2009 ARM framework. So I think, that language that is in the addendum and the description of the old model about, these thresholds in terms of recovery of the knots and the crabs themselves before female harvest is provided for, is now being left behind. And I appreciate Mr. Miller's comments about, these are recommendations, but the public, and I think some of the stakeholders, that question was not debated in the stakeholder process, at least not one that sort of integrally involved a lot of people, which I think is why you're seeing the reactions you are. But I think it's also, we're urging you to maintain that policy that to not allow the harvest of females, particularly because of the eggs needed by the birds, and the fact that we haven't recovered to the conservation thresholds that have been identified. I think that's a question that ought to be worked out before it goes out to the public, because it is a fundamental policy frame for your decision making, and we would urge you to retain that as you go forward. On the transparency part of it, I think it's in transparency and whether information is sufficient and whether people have had access to it. It really seems to me that the stakeholders or the public should be the ones to decide whether or not they had enough information. I understand the confidentiality laws, which are very problematic to me in terms of the management of a public resource. But I think you should take to heart the idea that central stakeholders are saying, we still have questions about the mechanics of this model, and we'd like to examine them for ourselves to our own satisfaction. So I appreciate your work, and thank you for the opportunity to provide the comments.
Thank you, Tim. Joe, did you have something you want to follow up on those comments?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's an indulgence as the former chair. Perhaps Dr. Anstead could discuss how the old model would have allowed harvest, and it was knife edge. And in fact, if a threshold was hit, it would more or less be wide open after that. So it's important, I think, to have a discussion on, and of course, if this does go out for public comment, that discussion can happen on the best way forward. But to talk about, what the old model really allowed with that knife edge, and then perhaps why this is a potential improvement as an actual safety measure.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do the best that I can with this. In the old model, there were two thresholds, which you're probably familiar with. There was a horseshoe crab threshold and a red knot threshold. And if you got to one of those thresholds, either one, most likely the harvest package selected would be the maximum amount of harvest. So in a scenario where horseshoe crabs from the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey hit that 11 million around there population number, you would automatically jump to 210 female harvests and 500 or slightly less than that for the males. There was some criticism during the peer review that these knife edge functions, so it's all or nothing, was not ideal, and also might not be adaptive management, because you're kind of putting on top of it what the answer should be by saying you have to hit this level or this level. That's not really adaptive management. That's sort of a harvest control rule. So when we came to the revision, we did two different things. We changed the objective functions so that we would give credit to both red knots and both horseshoe crabs. Before, it was just credit for horseshoe crabs. So you get a little bit of credit if your horseshoe crab populations are hitting some level. So that's not the maximum. It's kind of more of a S shape. So it kind of slowly ramps up to maximum harvest. Same with the birds. So instead of saying you get no credit for birds below the 81,000, it kind of slowly, when you're at the 40, you get just a tiny bit, and it slowly ramps up to that 81,000. So in combination, you get a little bit of credit if the horseshoe crabs are high, a little bit of credit if the birds are not below certain levels, and more credit as their populations increase. And those two kind of work together, and that's why you get female harvest now. So those values are still in there, but they're not acting as thresholds. They're kind of acting as an ideal situation we'd like to get to. But when the population specifically of horseshoe crabs is growing, you get a little bit more credit. It doesn't automatically jump to that 210. So we thought that that was a way to deal with it, address the peer review comments, and continue to use adaptive management to assess the species.
Thank you for that explanation, Kristen. The next commenter we have from the public is Ben Levitan.
Hi, thanks so much. This is Ben Levitan. I work at Earth Justice, and I submitted the FOIA requests and information requests that you all were discussing. Those were submitted on behalf of New Jersey Audubon and Defenders of Wildlife. I really appreciate the discussion that you all had raising concerns about those FOIA requests, and I just thought that a little bit more context might help inform your consideration of this issue. So we submitted requests for information to ASMFC, FWS, and USGS back in February. And as was mentioned, ASMFC did provide us with information about the CMSA model. However, that was only one of the 4 components of the model that ASMFC described as comprising the new ARM framework. The other 3 modeling components are all held by USGS. And just to give you an update on where that FOIA request stands, last week, USGS officially denied the request for those models pursuant to the deliberative process privilege. So those aren't even pending at this point. USGS has said that those are deliberative and cannot be released. The other thing that USGS informed us over email is that they are actually hoping and intending to publish those models, but they are still undergoing fundamental science practices review within USGS, which is a necessary step before they can be published. So it seems like the review process at USGS is still ongoing for whether these models are even appropriate for public viewing at this point. And on top of that, USGS is planning, apparently, relatively soon, to release the models to the public. So, from that, I would say 2 things. One, it seems like it would be, a real move for transparency for the board just to allow USGS to release the models on its own timeline as it's planning to do before opening the public comment period, so that the public is able to see the model that it's being asked to comment upon. The other point that I would make, and I totally understand the concern that the public could submit records requests just as sort of a manipulative technique to delay the process. That's really not where we are. We submitted these requests 5 months ago, more than 5 months ago. And at this point, it's not even about the timeline of our requests. We're just waiting on the federal agency, USGS, to release the models on its own timeline. So, the ball is in their court. It's not some strategy that we're using to try to delay this process. We just feel that the public needs to see what they're being asked to comment upon. It seems like the models will be released to the public fairly soon anyway, and that should just happen before the public comment period opens. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Ben. And I don't believe we have anybody from USGS online to address that. Do we have another hand from the board? Were there any other public comments? Okay, we don't have any other public comments. So Bill Hyatt.
Yeah, John, I was going to ask the same question you just asked. If there was anybody available who might, from either USGS or who might be able to address some of the comments that were just made relative to timeline and review process and what is actually happening within USGS.
Thanks, Bill.
I do think that's valuable information to have.
Sure. Agreed. And we do have one more commenter from the public. That is Matthew Sarver. Go ahead, Matt.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to just briefly echo many of the thoughts that Tim made, comments that Tim made a few minutes ago around this. I do think it's important, for the board to remember that for a lot of the stakeholders. So first of all, I'm the conservation chair of the Delaware Ornithological Society here in Delaware. It's all volunteer bird conservation organization. We're not all particularly well versed in the inner workings of ASMFC and the various boards and processes and so forth. And I personally, I'm a professional ecologist. I have a hard time sometimes finding information on these public comment periods, revisions, et cetera, even on the ASMFC website. And I think that's important to keep in mind with, thinking about the opportunity for stakeholder and public input into some of these changes, is that, it's not particularly easy for a lot of folks from the public who aren't fisheries management professionals to know where to find some of this information. And I think that's part of why a lot of folks in the bird conservation world are, perhaps weren't involved initially in some of the comment on the during the peer review process and so forth. And I think part of that is also has to do with what Tim said, which is that, you know, ostensibly looking at a technical revision of an adaptive resource framework doesn't necessarily imply to members of the public that there's going to be a major change in stated policy. I think as I share the same concern that he referenced with regard to the female harvest threshold that was presented in the past. And I think that this sort of policy direction change that seems to be happening within this science technical process as a result of changing the ARM is really the issue here for a lot of us, and being a little bit blindsided by how that change within what seemed like it was a needed and is a needed and valid process to change the ARM. So I would just say that there's a broader issue here for me at least, and one of those is looking at the ARM goals. To me they don't show targeting an increase back to a higher population level for horseshoe crab, which would support continued success of red knots. The ARM looks to me to project essentially a no loss, and unless I'm misinterpreting it, keeping the population at current levels, which I think a lot of us thought was not the goal long term for this resource. So I guess that's just a broader concern here for me, more so than the exact data, the exact model runs, all that kind of thing. I have good confidence in the folks who worked on this, the scientists from multiple agencies that had input. I have more of a concern with where we're trying to get and the overall problem of shifting baselines in fisheries management and what that means for these connected ecological resources in the future. One other specific point I would make is, again, if I'm interpreting the model correctly, is that there was one statistically significant factor for adult horseshoe crab survival, which was abundance of female, or I'm sorry, adult red knot survival, which was the abundance of female horseshoe crabs. And so I find it interesting that, that was one of the only pieces of data found to be significant in the model, but yet the model is still, generating a female harvest. I didn't really understand that. Maybe somebody could clarify that for me. And I realized that adult survival for red knots was not found to be the major population determinant. It was more recruitment. However, if female horseshoe crab abundance is a significant factor for adult survival, it seems like that should be an important consideration with a federally listed species, even though it's perhaps not the major determinant of population trends for the bird. So anyway, those are my thoughts, and I appreciate the discussion.
We appreciate the comments, and Kristen can, to the question you had in there, she can respond to that, and then we are getting a little short on time, so we're going to take one more comment from the public after Kristen responds here.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You are correct that there is a link between female horseshoe crab abundance and red knot survival. And I think that where the confusion might be is that the horseshoe crab female population has been increasing, the adult mature population that's going to spawn. So if you look at either the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey by itself, we use the Delta distribution swept area estimate. There are several time series in their report each year, but there's one that we use specifically, or you use our catch survey population estimates, which we think are the best estimates available. Both of those have been increasing over time. So if their female population is around 10 million mature female horseshoe crabs, the model is still recommending some female harvest because that population is considered quite high. So if you have 10 million females and the harvest coming out is about 140,000 females, the model doesn't see that as conflicting in the purpose of the management.
Thank you, Kristen. We have one more comment from the public. Because we are running short on time, the commenter is Faith Zerby. We're going to have to limit it to 3 minutes. So thank you, and take it away, Faith.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. My name is Faith Zerby. I'm Director of Monitoring with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I won't be using the 3-minute time, so perhaps you could have others speak if possible, if there are others. We've been monitoring horseshoe crabs along the Delaware Bay. Myself, I've been out there for over 22 years. This year, of course, we've also participated in egg survey density studies that have been done by the shorebird team. So we're learning a lot on the ground. I really would just urge you to use the precautionary principle here and not allow this to move forward at this time. Certainly, Mr. Levitin from Earth Justice has talked about the issue of USGS and this information that if they are still looking at information related to the models, understanding if the model is really operating as they would choose, moving this forward now at this point would be premature in our eyes. We also would just say that it would appear, and again, the presentation by the presenter was very good. It was nice to see those slides. It's very fast. There's a lot of information there also to digest, of course, so we can't just take it on agency standard that this is, adequate for the public. The other point I would note is that it was talked about if the commissioners do decide to move this forward today, that there may be public hearings, I believe in August or September, which we would also urge is completely premature and would not allow adequate time for the public. People take vacations in August. They're getting their kids ready to go back to school. As you all talk about and have said, the public has a hard time looking at this information. It's a lot of information to digest, and Earth Justice doesn't even have the information that they requested in February. So this just feels like, a rush job forward to basically turn up more female crabs for fish bait. Again, we're on the water. We see the crabs during our spawning surveys. We've participated in bird surveys last year. The red knot was the lowest it had been in years. So this just is completely flying in the face of what we need, to the point that you might have this ARM model and then you have a framework, but then we may decide not to take female crabs. Just looking at how the industry works and how things have been in the past. Again, we've been doing this for decades, working on this. I'm sure that if the ARM model is recommending female crab harvest, it's going to be very hard to stop that train coming from off the tracks. So I would just urge you to hold the line. It sounds like USGS is also not available to acknowledge what Mr. Levitin said. We'd echo what American Littoral Society has said, and really just others on the ground and the scientists on the ground to just please just hold the line right now and vote to not take this forward at this time. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you for the comment, Ms. Zerby. To your specific point about the public comment period, I just want to turn it over to Caitlin again to refresh us on that before we call the question, but also to remind you that you don't have to attend a public hearing in order to comment. The comment period is going to be open for much longer. Written comments are accepted. They can be emailed, they can be mailed. So we want as much public input as possible in this process. And I'll let Caitlin comment further on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so if the document is approved today, it would take a little bit of time to set up a public hearing schedule and get the notice out on that. So it's unlikely that hearings would occur in August. I think the public comment period would be open, but the typical process is that we have the public comment period open 2 weeks in advance of any public hearings, and then following the public hearings as well. So there would be more time for public comment via written comments, which again can be emailed, mailed, or faxed. And then those public hearings would probably occur in September.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Is there any further discussion on this motion by the board? Okay, not seen. Do we have any online? Or okay. Given that, I will call the question. Do we need time to caucus? All right, I'm not seeing anybody. Oh, you do want to call. Okay, 3-minute caucus.
I just want to note really quickly a clarification to what Caitlin said. We will do our best to have a 2-week opening 2 weeks prior and 2 weeks after. It is not required in addenda, but we've heard from the public that this is complicated, and so therefore we will do our best. But if some state wants a late hearing, then we may not be able to make that perfect.
Okay, did everybody have enough time to caucus? Does anybody need more time? You need more time, Mike? Okay, before I go to you, Mike, Bill Hyatt asked to ask a question, and then I'll go to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if today we were to approve this to go out for public comment, and assuming then that at the annual meeting, we would be looking to take further action, is it safe to assume that we could get, as that process is unfolding, some updates on where things stand relative to USGS and how they're handling the requests that have been put forth? Thank you.
Kristen, do you want to respond to that?
I want to talk a little bit about the models, just to manage expectations about this. I'm not speaking on behalf of USGS at all. The way that this ARM revision model works is there are several models that feed into the adaptive management entirety model. So I have part of it. Anna Tucker at USGS did the bird modeling, and then they feed into this larger model. What we have struggled with, even as a committee, is how to get that model all in one place because of the massive size and complexity of it. So even now, my computer doesn't have enough cores to run the full ARM model, because the vision was to hand over the model to me so I can run it each year, and we have not resolved how to do that yet. It's fairly common for our stock assessments to have models spread over several computers, so that's not unusual in this case, but this is one of the most complex models that I've worked with, and I'm not sure what the platform will be to make That's not to say we don't want to make it public, but it will probably have to go on a GitHub. And I don't know how we will run it from there as individual people, apart from the data confidentiality. These are not excuses. This is just something we have struggled with.
And Bill,
Thank you, Kristen.
we can give you an update, if we can get something from USGS on where they are in their, internal deliberative process, and to give you that. But I think what Kristen is trying to say is that your average stakeholder would not be able to run the model itself. Yes, there are individuals out there in the world that can, look at this and do this, but it's your average person. I myself could never do it. I'm included in that group.
Follow up, Bill?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I was asking just for an update, and it was specifically because what I thought I heard before, while not coming directly from the USGS, was that there was an internal review going and that there was a commitment to, in one form, shape, or another, to be able to provide this model out to those who are interested in looking at it. And I don't know what form or shape that will take. So what I was asking primarily is just as long as we can be assured that we're going to be updated as information is available. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And Mike, you had a comment?
Yeah, it was along the same lines that Bill was just asking about. I was talking to Roy, and we were saying, the points that were made by, through public comment were good points. And if USGS is, it's a shame we can't get any update from them today. But I just wonder if, I was starting to think that maybe we can just get an agreement, as direction to staff from the board, and moving forward that we pump the brake just a little bit and give a little bit more time to the USGS to get that information out before we start to have the hearings. But I don't know if there's any appetite around the table for trying to set up something like that, where in the way I was thinking was, if we don't have information from USGS by October 1st, we could then go to the public to get feedback. Or as part of the public comment, the comment could be, we don't have the right information to comment on, and then the board gets to deliberate on that in November as well. So I see there being two ways forward so that we get the feedback that we need from the public. But I'm not trying to complicate things. So I don't know. Mr.
Thanks,
Chairman.
Mike. Tony has a response for you.
Mike, if we waited until October, we would not be able to bring this back to you all. So that would be too late for November. And again, I'll restate that we have had a very open and transparent process for the review of this model. If the public want to comment that they want to see different thresholds, different, I'm using that as a paraphrase. I know that's not the exact right term, Kristen. Some other evaluation of the bird data, then they can provide that data to the board, and the board can consider that as you decide how to move forward. These are products, what comes out of the ARM is a package, and the board gets to decide what to do with that package. You don't have to have female harvest, and then a state can decide if they want to have female harvest if the board approves that package. And so, I think the public can add all of these types of comments to their public comment. But in terms of the model itself and the review of it, we've had this transparent process, and I'm not sure that is going to change. I think USGS, when they have models, do internal reviews. It's not necessarily doing this independent peer review like we completed. I think it's just an in-house process before they release packages.
Thanks, Tony. Before I call the question, we have another comment from Rick Jacobson.
Oh, thank you. And this really builds on Bill and Mike's comments. If I'm correct, nothing of a decision of the commission to move forward with this motion, to adopt this motion and go to public comment, in no way binds commission's actions come the November meeting. Is that correct? I mean, we have the opportunity to review what public comment comes in and then consider anew what actions we feel are most appropriate to take at that time. Is that correct?
That's correct, Rick. Okay, thank you. We've had a very good discussion on this, but now it's time to call the questions. So all those in favor of the motion, please indicate by raising your right hand.
I have Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, and Delaware.
Noah votes yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service votes yes as well.
Okay, so we have 2 yes votes from online. All right, are we ready for no votes? Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand. Seeing none. And I think by process of elimination, we don't have any abstentions or null votes, do we? If anybody, no, okay, it looks like the motion passes. And what is the final tally, Caitlin? It's 15 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstentions, and 0 null votes. So what are the next steps now, Caitlin? Would you just want to review that again?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So after this meeting, we will publish the document for public comment. We will release a press release with a hearing schedule. So I will be reaching out to all the states to get information from each state on whether they'd like to have an in-person public hearing and what their availability is to put that schedule together. So those should be our next steps. We will have a public press release to let everyone know when that comment period is open.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Thank you to the board for the discussion on that and the public. And now we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is going to be back with Caitlin again, which is to update on plan development team review of the biomedical mortality, biologically based options for setting the threshold, and best management practices for handling biomedical collections. Take it away, Caitlin.
Thank you again. So next slide, please. Just quickly, in this presentation, I'm going to go over the board task to the plan development team, provide some background information and data on the topic, and then I'm going to pass it off to our technical committee chair, Natalie Amaral, to cover the TC's discussion and recommendations on this issue. And then Brett Hoffmeister, who's here at the front with us, is the advisory panel chair for Horseshoe Crab, and he'll cover the AP report. And then I will wrap up with the PDT recommendation and set the board up for discussion today. Next slide. So the task that the board assigned to the plan development team had 2 components. And the first part was to review the threshold for the biomedical mortality, to develop biologically based options for that threshold, and to develop options for action when that threshold is exceeded. The second part was to review the best management practices for handling biomedical catch and suggest options for updating and implementing the BMPs. And then the reason that the board assigned this task is that during the FMP review last year, it was noted that the annual threshold for mortality for crabs used for biomedical purposes, which is established in the fishery management plan, has been exceeded in almost all of the last 13 years. So the board wanted to take a look into this and assign this task to the PDT. Next slide. So the FMP language on this states that if horseshoe crab mortality associated with collecting, shipping, handling, or use by the biomedical industry exceeds 57,500 horseshoe crabs per year, the commission would reevaluate potential restrictions on horseshoe crab harvest by the biomedical industry. So it should be noted that this threshold was set simply based on estimates of the annual biomedical mortality at the time that the FMP was developed in the 1990s, and it does not have any scientific or biological basis to it. Next slide. So to provide more context, this graph shows the bait harvest levels and the biomedical mortality levels. The orange area is the bait harvest, and the blue sliver on top is the coastwide biomedical mortality estimated in each year. So as you can see, the vast majority of total mortality throughout the time series is bait harvest, and the blue area representing the biomedical mortality is relatively small, and it doesn't change very dramatically from year to year. So in the whole time series, the biomedical has remained under 20% of the total mortality. Next slide. To show this data another way, this table shows the ASMFC coastwide quota for bait in the top row. And then the second row is the total allowed bait harvest under the more restrictive state quotas. The actual coastwide bait harvest is below that in the third row. And then the next rows are the coastwide biomedical mortality estimates and the total mortality with bait and biomedical added together. So on the bottom, the two rows there are showing the total mortality, bait plus biomedical, as a percent of the overall ASMFC quota and the combined state quotas. So what you see from this is that when the biomedical mortality is added on top of bait harvest, the total has remained well below the ASMFC coastwide bait quota, except, and then in the final row, except in 2017, it has also remained under the bait harvest limit that's allowed under the state restrictive state quotas. So that's how it compares to the ASMFC quotas for bait harvest. So as we discussed earlier, next slide, the biomedical mortality is accounted for in the ARM, in the framework revision for the Delaware Bay population, which is this is the only population where we have biologically based harvest specifications. And so if Addendum 8 is adopted, that Delaware Bay specific biomedical mortality would be accounted for in setting the harvest specifications for the Delaware Bay. Next slide. So switching gears to the other part of this task, the best management practices for handling biomedical collections were developed by an ad hoc work group in 2011. So this BMP list is a list of recommended practices to minimize stress, injury, and mortality of biomedical horseshoe crabs in every step of the process from when they are collected to when they're returned to the sea. And the horseshoe crab FMP recommends that these BMPs be followed by biomedical industry and harvesters, but the BMPs are not required by the ASMFC. So what the Commission's FMP does require is that states must issue a special permit for or authorization for collecting crabs for biomedical purposes. And also they must return the horseshoe crabs that are taken for biomedical purposes to the same state or federal waters from which they were collected. Next slide. So with that background, I'm going to hand it over to Natalie to present on the TC discussion. And Natalie, if you're not unmuted, please raise your hand so we can unmute you.
Good morning. I think I should be unmuted.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Caitlin. So to summarize our TC discussion on the biomedical mortality threshold, the first thing we did was reach out to the SAS to look at multiple CSMA runs and population simulations. Using those, we did not find any significant impacts. The real issue here is that we lack coastwide biological reference points, and there are regional differences in stock status. So not only can we not determine how biomedical mortality thresholds would impact each region, we are not sure how to even set that number to begin with. So a lot of emphasis was also placed on sex ratios playing into these issues as well. To summarize our BMP discussion, to figure out where each state stands as far as implementing BMPs, each TC member per state provided information on what requirements currently exist. And the disparities we saw between states, I think, was largely attributed to different seasonality and harvest methods employed by each state. So if we go to the next slide, I can summarize our recommendations. So currently, we don't have the data to inform upon a biologically based threshold for biomedical mortality. And also importantly, we only have a population estimate for Delaware Bay. To summarize the best management practices, right now, we think that our best focus for best management practices for decreasing mortality would be to assemble a working group, and I think that is recommended on the next slide. So really, if we want to spend the time to review, revise, and recommend updated BMPs, we will probably need the time allowed to a working group to pursue that option. And I think with that, I am handing it off to Brett for the AP summary.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Caitlin. So the AP met virtually on July 11th. Caitlin started us off the review of the TC documents or review. Right out of the gate, there was comments on biomedical mortality with some of the AP members maintaining that the 15% estimate we thought was high, pointing to the fact that many of the papers that were used for the 2019 benchmark assessment did not follow many of the BMPs. There was only a handful that did. So it was just really a notation. It was also pointed out that the Smith paper released in 2020 was really a good example of the effects of long-term biomedical processes. So this looked at, almost 70,000 crabs that were bled by biomedical companies over many years. So we thought that that was a good reference. One AP member repeatedly was concerned about egg densities on the beaches, about them remaining low in the Delaware Bay region, as well as post-handling effects of biomedical use on horseshoe crabs, regardless of the estimated mortality levels. So this prompted some discussion, really talking about the timing of the egg density studies, the design of the studies themselves, and the fact that they weren't used in the benchmark assessment at the time. This member stated that they had a lot of data, and we encourage them to share that with the ASMSC in the future. As far as the post-handling of the biomedical crabs, the BMPs are designed to address some of that. So those are just comments there. Comments directly related to the BMPs. Another member was concerned about the vagueness of the BMP language, leaving too much room for interpretation. So for example, recommendation that tows are around 30 minutes suggested that maybe we make that a requirement. Another would be release area. Where should you release the crab? Should it be at the same, Latin Long location where they were caught? So the biomedical members kind of countered that really the BMPs were designed to be somewhat variable because of the practices along the coast. As the TC noted, each state is very different in its fisheries practices. There's methods of harvest, equipment that vary. So the BMPs are a pretty comprehensive list of recommendations, but we didn't see that they could really be codified. Again, things such as temperature controlled transport may make sense in one place and another. Waters in Massachusetts are much cooler than they are in South Carolina. So not, all things considered equal, it's not really possible to have a lot of recommendations on these BMPs that'll fit every nook and cranny. There was concern voiced about collection during spawning activity, and was reminded that many states have specific regulations to protect spawning horseshoe crabs, such as lunar closures, daily quotas, weekly quotas, or late seasons, such as I know at least one processor in Delaware Bay region, they don't even start harvesting till mid-June or late June. I guess the message from the biomedical industry was that we are following the relevant and applicable BMPs and doing everything reasonable to address, mortality and injury with these crabs. It is in the best interest of the biomedical companies to do that. We need healthy animals for a good product. So that was a point of some discussion. It was also noted that the states have incorporated some of the BMPs into regulations. So things like storage conditions, transport, data collection, marking crabs to prevent rebleeding are things that are found in some of the permitting or contingencies to permitting in some of the states. Biomedical members were suggesting some minor language changes and the elimination of the recommendation to check salinity at release points. So prior to this meeting, I did reach out to the industry. We reviewed the BMPs and suggested some minor changes. I think you'll see some of that in the memo that's a part of the materials. It was also stated as a general statement by the biomedical companies that the preservation of the species is a common goal. And I'll just remind people that, we've been doing this for about 50 years, long before there was any management of the fishery itself. This has been a goal with the catch and release fishery and whatnot. So overall, I thought it was a good dialogue with the meeting, and there was some good input, but no great surprises here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Thanks, Caitlin, and thank you, Natalie. You have some comments to follow up?
Sorry, I just have a few more slides here. So I just want to go to the next slide on the PDT recommendations. So considering what the TC and AP inputted on this issue, the PDT has made a recommendation not to use a biologically based biomedical mortality threshold at this time because there's currently insufficient data to support the coast-wide threshold based on biological reference points. The PDT said that any coast-wide mortality thresholds would not be scientifically based. So the PDT does agree with reviewing and discussing the best management practices to propose recommended updates, which could be done through a work group, such as what was originally put together to develop those BMPs. Next slide. So I think to start the board's discussion on this topic, it would be helpful to hear how the board wishes to move forward, both with the mortality threshold issue and with the BMPs. So some questions to think about are, is the board interested in forming a work group to address either of these issues? And what should the focus of that work group be? So with that, I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. Now, thank you, Caitlin, Natalie, and Brett. And does the board have any questions or comments on the biomedical here? Emerson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Caitlin, Natalie, and Brett for your presentations. So my question is, since we indicate in the FMP a threshold for biomedical collection of crabs, and every year we exceed that, and we just say, well, okay, we exceeded it. I mean, so how do we go forward here relative to this biomedical threshold? Do we just leave the FMP as it is and ignore it essentially, or is there some other direction we should go in? Because I understand that we cannot develop a biologically based threshold for biomedical collection. Thank you.
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Thanks, Emerson, for the question. So I think this is really a matter of what the board is interested in doing. So there is a threshold in the FMP of 57,500 crabs for a mortality threshold for the biomedical industry. Again, that was just based on estimates of what it was at the time. So if the board wanted to change that threshold in some way, it would require an addendum. I think the options for something that could be done through an addendum would be removing the threshold, modifying the threshold, or potentially changing it in some other way that a work group could potentially propose. So those are my initial thoughts on how to move forward if you want to change that threshold in some way.
Do you have any follow-up on that, Emerson?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know what the sense of the rest of the board is, but we've been ignoring that threshold for, what did you say, Caitlin, 14 years, I think? So if we've been ignoring it for 14 years, I guess we could continue to ignore it unless somebody thinks we really need to move forward with an addendum. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions for Caitlin? Not seeing any. Can we put the PDT recommendations back up on the screen? Oh, Bob?
Yeah, well, while the recommendations are coming back up, just to kind of respond to Emerson's comment, I wouldn't characterize it as the board is ignoring the threshold. I think, it's reported out every year where we stand relative to that threshold. The board looks at it and decides whether it's a significant component of mortality. And if you remember the slide with the orange block and the blue sliver, it's a small component. So I get what you're saying. They haven't reacted and haven't made any management changes, but I don't want anyone to perceive that the board just doesn't care. The board does, get a report out where we stand relative to that number and looks at it and hasn't decided that it's met a threshold where we need to have a management reaction to it.
And Caitlin?
Yeah, if I could just add on to that slightly. So again, the language in the FMP says that if that threshold is exceeded, the commission would reevaluate potential restrictions on horseshoe crab harvest by the biomedical industry. And I do think it's accurate to say that that's what the board has been doing every year when they get the report out on what the biomedical mortality estimate is. And then through this process that the board just asked of the PDT to evaluate the information and look into some options, I think that, reevaluation of potential restrictions. So I think what Bob said stands, and if there needs to be a change to that, the board can initiate an addendum.
Yeah, we have these suggestions here from the plan development team, of course, that if the board was to move ahead with the work group to come up with best management practices, I'm assuming a new addendum could also address the biomedical threshold. But sorry, I think I saw another hand. Dan?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm assuming that in the annual plan review document, there's a statement in there that says that even though the threshold's been exceeded, this is inconsequential because the overall mortality is declining. Is that accurate?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember if we have a statement exactly to that effect, but it is given as a percentage of the total mortality. So I don't know if there's a desire for more information, we can add it.
I would recommend that be stated. That way there's some, position that we're comfortable with that says, yeah, we know we're exceeding it, but it's no big deal.
Thanks, Dan. Any other comments on this? Does the board wish to proceed with the recommendations of the PDT on this issue? Dan?
Yeah, I would welcome PDT analysis of the levels of mortality attributable to the biomedical firms, maybe on a regional basis, because since we have quotas on a regional basis, on a state basis, as states we're managing these activities, the potential take for that industry is not infinite. And so I guess it would be good to have some kind of a conversation about that by the PDT.
I'm seeing shaking heads over here, Dan. I think that gets into confidentiality issues, and that's why it's not broken out that way. But is that something that can or should be looked into further, or are we kind of stuck on that?
So I think that was part of what the technical committee discussed through this process, was that while we have the biomedical information from each of the states and can look at it regionally, we don't have population estimates for each region. So there's no way to compare, what is an acceptable level of biomedical mortality or any type of mortality, including bait, for those regions, because we don't have population estimates.
Any follow-up, Dan?
Yeah, well, frankly, we have a trend in Massachusetts that's very positive. We have an annual bait harvest that is published. We're pretty confident that the levels of mortality at this time attributable to bait harvest and whatever's going on with the confidential biomedical harvest is probably rather appropriate. And so I just don't want to be handcuffed to actually having a management strategy going forward. So I'll work with this, internally. It's not necessarily for discussion today, but this does represent a blind spot for horseshoe crab management, for us state managers to not even be able to assure the public that we got this, that the number of crabs being killed at a local level, within a state is appropriate. I'm confident that it is, but I'm just, in the future, I'd like to maybe make some headway on that.
Thanks, Dan. Are there any other comments on Connor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would just make a comment on the second recommendation, and I would support that a work group be developed to review the best practices. It's been a while, I believe, since there's been a formal technical amendment or review of the document, and I appreciate the feedback of the AP and the TC and the PDT to date on it. I think it just provides us an opportunity to reassess the practices more holistically.
Thanks, Connor. Is there, I see Emerson's hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I agree with Connor. And do we need a motion to that effect, or is just consensus fine?
I don't believe, do we need? We can do it by consensus. Does the board agree that we should put together a working group on this? I'm not seeing any opposition, so yep, we can do that. And in terms of what Dan was asking, is there enough information there that something can be pursued, or are we just kind of at an impasse on that whole issue?
I think I could get more information from Dan, maybe on what he's looking for after the meeting or now. In terms of the work group, I am hearing that we want to look at the BMPs. So I just want to clarify, is there any interest in thinking about this mortality issue any further? Or is the board comfortable with keeping the threshold as it is? I just want to make sure we don't need to be doing any additional work beyond looking at the BMPs.
We have Emerson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm fine with leaving things the way they are relative to the threshold. As long as, we incorporate in the annual FMP review the language that Dan suggested, I think that puts us in good shape.
Any other comments? Dan?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm comfortable leaving it just to the best management practices at this time. I will kind of deal with my local level issues locally.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, any further comments on this, or are we ready to move on from this topic? Okay, not seeing any. We're going to move on to our next item, which is review and populate the advisory panel membership, and that is Tina.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer for your consideration and approval David Meservey, an inshore commercial otter trawler from Massachusetts.
Maya, we have the, there we go.
Okay, and we also had two more from Delaware.
Okay, forgive me, but I was not aware of those nominations, but if you have them in your packet, then you know better than I.
Okay, Tina. Well, yeah, I think they were in the supplemental and they're in the motion, so we are fine on that. And we have a motion by Dan McKiernan, seconded by Emerson Hasbrook there. And is there any opposition to this motion?
Mr. Chairman, can you read the motion, please?
Oh, certainly. Move to approve Horseshoe Crab Advisory Panel nominations for David Meservey from Massachusetts, Jordan Jatari and Matt Sarver from Delaware. Motion by Mr. McKiernan, seconded by Mr. Hasbrook. Any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, the motion is approved by consent. And now we are on to our penultimate item, which is elect a vice chair. Do we have a nomination? Joe Semino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know how good it feels to have a vice chair waiting in the wings. I move to elect Dr. Justin Davis from Connecticut as vice chair of the Horseshoe Crab Management Board.
And we have a second by Jim Gilmore. And I'd say everybody's in approval of this nomination. Congratulations, Justin. All right, and thank you. Okay, that brings us to our last item, which is other business. In the interest of time, maybe we do have a discussion maybe we could have in the future about the amount of misinformation that has been out there over this. But given that we are already running late, shall we just adjourn the meeting at this point? Okay, we will, no objections to that. So the Horseshoe Crab Board is adjourned. Thank you.